Hello, everyone. Welcome to Timeless Voyager, where the knowledge is timeless and you are the Voyager. I am your host, Stephen Holms. So strap your cosmic seatbelts on and prepare for some turbulence. Today's guest is Andrew D. Basiago. Today we finalize the Time Slip series with part 5. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Yeah, at the end of the fourth segment, I stated my conviction, and I think it's well evidenced, that a set of conditions, or maybe one cause, is actually causing the time-space continuum to be damaged. Over the first 4 shows, I discussed time slips. Today, I'd like to discuss 4 examples of Mandela effects, and then share some evidence that it's in fact radiation from nuclear explosions and nuclear energy that are causing these instances of some change in the time-space continuum. And I think it's a very important reality that we should give more attention to.
All right. You have the stage.
All right. So under the Mandela effects, let me just give a few examples of really good examples of the Mandela effect. The Mandela effect, of course, was named for those who believed that Nelson Mandela had actually died while a prisoner at Robben Island, rather than to be released from prison and go on to be the first president of the new South Africa. So that's why we call them Mandela effects. But one really great example is that everybody remembers that the Monopoly board game featured a character to represent Monopoly that had a monocle. In fact, I've been doing an experiment and I've now asked about 20 individuals, what do you remember? Did the character from Monopoly have a monocle or did not have a one-eye piece, a monocle? And everybody remembers that he did. Now, I know somebody who competed, in our generation in Monopoly contests, and he would even keep a monocle in his pocket to kind of tease his competitors when he would win the game. He has been all over the world looking for examples of Monopoly and been unable to find the original board game with the monocled character. So that can't just be memory. What we're talking about are physical changes in the time-space continuum. That would include, for example, passages in Scripture. I not only remember that the Bible used to say that when Jesus came back and there was a new world, the lion would lay down with the lamb. But in fact, I know people have searched even in 100-year-old and 150-year-old Bibles. They literally shop for an antique Bible. And now, apparently, all of the Bibles on earth say that the wolf shall lay down with the lamb. Well, that's another example of an actual physical change in the time-space continuum. Because when I was a child growing up as a Roman Catholic adherent, there was a kind of a movement post-Vatican Council for Catholic churches, particularly on the East Coast of this country, to allow kids in Sunday school or what have you to make these kind of felt posters, artistically rendering a certain passage from Scripture. I remember that at my church, which was Notre Dame of Mount Carmel in Cedar Hills, New Jersey, that biblical passage was that the lion shall lay down with the lamb. That particular poster featured a lion and a lamb. But it wasn't until more recent times that for some reason, apparently every Bible on earth was changed to the wolf shall lay down with the lamb. which is obviously less memorable and less even alliterative as a passage from Scripture. So something is changing reality. Another example, of course, would be music that has been sung by particular artists. It can't be re-sung unless it's sort of a retrospective or a cover of that song by another group or something. Then obviously it could be changed.
Right, or re-recorded or something like that.
Yeah, but if it's the original recording from like the 1960s, how could it be different? But it isn't the case of California Dreaming by the Mamas and the Papas. It originally said, at least we remember that it said, what does it say? I walked into a church that I found along the way, and I got down on my knees and I began to pray, which makes perfect sense as a lyric. But what does it now say?
I don't know. That sounds like
pretend to pray.
Yeah, that's how I remember the first example you gave. I mean, I was there in those days, so I remember that.
Right. Here's somebody who was, from the beginning of that generation, who was in music, who was a music producer, and you're saying you remember what we remember, which was that it said, I walked into a church that I found along the way. I got down on my knees and I began to pray. So why does it now say, even in editions of the Mamas and the Papas, and I pretend to pray? That doesn't even make sense. And it's kind of almost like intentionally irreligious, as if to kind of make a different point, sort of. But that, in fact, is what it now says, is that I found along the way, and I got down on my knee, and I pretend to pray. It doesn't make any sense. And another example I found
Incidentally, that's one that anybody can look up, so we can, fact check it ourselves and find out what happened here.
Is it a cover of that iconic song from the 60s by the Mamas and the Papas? I'm not even sure all the Mamas and the Papas, like, for example, John Phillips, are even alive at this point. I'd have to check that. But I know as somebody born in 1961, who was following most of the music of the 60s from the age in which I could listen to music, 3 or 4, that it originally said, and I began to pray. It didn't say, and I pretend to pray. Another example is depictions of very famous oratory by American presidents. For example, the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. When it was depicted by Ken and Rick Burns in their classic documentary, The Civil War, filmed in 1989, they had Lincoln, as depicted by actor Sam Waterston, not say that they have thus far so nobly advanced, but instead say that they have thus far so nobly carried on, which is not even grammatical. Now, we have to be careful here with these Mandela effects. Maybe that's what Lincoln had originally written, like on the back of an envelope or something as he was coming to Gettysburg by a train. And they decided to have Sam Waterston recite exactly what Lincoln had originally written. But for generations, the depiction has been that they have thus far so nobly advanced. Why the sudden change to they have thus far so nobly carried on? So we have to be careful, but that could also be another Mandela effect. Certainly the biblical passage I cited, the Monopoly board game being changed, and that song by the Mamas and the Papas are physical changes. So when we're talking Mandela effect, we're not just describing bad memories or things that people could just make a mistake. For example, one that's often cited as a Mandela effect is that the name of the peanut butter was Jiffy. Well, no, it was always Jif. And people could become mistaken because there was a competing peanut brand called Skippy.
Hmm.
There was a popcorn brand called Jiffy Popcorn. So I exclude that from the group of Mandela effects, just to show how easy it is to make such mistakes. But I would say not in terms of that biblical passage, not in terms of that board game, and not in terms of our group memories of what the mamas and the papas had originally written. So I think I'm including Mandela effects with the time slips that we've already discussed, just to make a case that I believe that the time-space continuum is being altered. Now that matters. We don't want to live in a world in which we've been born and then people we know from history are born after us. Or, people, I don't know, get divorced before they get married. I mean, in other words, the logic of everyday life, if it's being unalterably altered, could be a disaster, could be a nightmarish reality where everything would be confused. You'd be competing in sporting competitions where you would find out that you lost the game, so you won, and other illogical types of outcomes such as that. Now, what I really wanted to focus on is, as I've done in the previous shows, ultimately, is what's causing this. I think that it's radiation from nuclear bombs being detonated and by nuclear energy. There is one good example that I can share with you today that I didn't share on the last broadcast to establish that. Consider this reality. We are a neighbor to the people of Mexico, and they to us. What could be the explanation for the fact that the American people have twice the diseases of civilization as the people of Mexico? I mean, among the blue zones where people are long-lived with good health, we know that those who eat fermented foods and legumes or beans tend to be long-lived with good health during that high longevity. But I don't believe just the fact that Mexican people are eating more beans than the average American could cause twice the diseases of civilization, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer in America than in Mexico. Mexico is a poorer country. There's a less supply of quality food and medicine and healthcare and wealth at the level lived by the everyday person. So really, the lower medical standards would naturally and logically result in higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer in Mexico. But they're only 50% of what we suffer in this country. But how are our two countries different? I'll give you one statistic. We have 200 nuclear power plants. Mexico has 0. And I add this as not a totally proven causation, but I think it is evidence that suggests what the causation actually is. And we should really consider banning nuclear power plants and joining with other major world powers in possession of nuclear weapons to not detonate those weapons. As I mentioned during one of the last episodes of this series, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's at least 2,200 that have been detonated since World War II. That is a lot of discharge of radiation. There are also a lot of incipient releases of radioactive plasma that seem connected to time slips, like that story I told last time we spoke about the Montélimar time slip in France.
Right.
That I had discovered the fact that shortly before the Gibneys and the Simpsons entered France from England via the Channel, and then had that weird time slip in Montelimar, I had found evidence that the largest release of radioactive plasma in the history of the French nuclear program had occurred in Montelimar. That it was not only the biggest nuclear power plant, but it had been the locus of the greatest release of radioactive plasma. I also cited the fact that I had a contact with an ET who said to me, you have to make sure, ask your government to stop blowing up nuclear weapons. And I said, why? And he said, because we know that they're creating holes in space, which is a very logical and compelling way of addressing the very problem that I've been addressing. What could this ET have meant about holes in space? Damage to the time-space continuum, perhaps? Actually providing a physical cause for that damage to the time-space continuum. That the time-space continuum is sort of being unalterably damaged with holes in space or in time-space. So that's basically what I wanted to share today, is that is really what the evidence is stacking up to be. That we thought we could detonate nuclear weapons and explore nuclear power with impunity, but it may be something that's inalterably damaging sort of the universe that we're living in. And that's a very fearsome possibility. It could not probably be remedied when it got really bad. I think we're at the threshold right now of unalterable damage. And, brilliant ufologists, for example, Richard Dolan, has discussed this fact that the post-war saucer flap was over the fact that we were in possession of nuclear bombs and nuclear energy, and we had the rockets and space planes to take them into the wider universe. And the ETs were visiting us mostly because of our nuclear menace that we represented to them and to the universe. Look at the fact that the famous 1947 saucer flap involved Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where we had the largest nuclear enrichment program, Hanford, Washington, where a former FBI agent, Kenneth Arnold, saw his famous ET sighting there. Hanford, Washington was where there was the largest nuclear waste repository in the United States. And then, of course, what iconic ET event, Roswell, New Mexico, where the only nuclear-equipped strategic bomb wing in the U.S. Air Force was located, the 509th. So the three most iconic and remembered and significant ET cases in 1947 were the most conspicuous nuclear sites in America, just 2 years after the explosion of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. So I think the handwriting is on the wall. We have been visited by ETs. They've warned us about our nuclear potential, as I was advised by one particular ET. It's in the historical record as being the causal basis for the 1947 saucer flaps. And I think we have to take it with more seriousness.
When you talk about this the way that you are, it underlines this lackadaisical approach that most politicians, government agencies, and of course a lot of the people of the country take when we talk about ufology and extraterrestrials. Because from their point of view, and I don't want to speak for those groups, but just the impression that I get is that it's quote unquote interesting. But you're saying it's not just interesting, it's a possible smoking gun that people have been missing And you're pointing it out right now.